great to have everyone here this morning. And I know that this past week and this past month, we've had a number of storms blow through, but wasn't this past Wednesday night quite the storm, huh? I was talking with somebody before the first service, and they were driving, trying to get someplace in a hurry, get someplace safe, and the lightning was going so fast, so just continuously, that any of the sensors that respond to light and dark were just flashing off and on because the lights couldn't figure out if it was supposed to be nighttime or light time, whatever. But we were in the Madison area, and a small tornado apparently touched down nearby, but just a small one. But this wasn't in the tornado area. This was just in a neighborhood where we were staying, my wife Susan and I, along with our daughter and her husband. And so these are some of the trees that came down. And looking at that, you're just like, wow, look at the destruction. And certainly some of us have probably experienced some of that, whether sticks are down or trees are down, maybe your basement flooded, and those things, it means a lot more work, right? It's a lot of headache, it's time, it's a lot of expenditure of energy. But the fact is that sticks can be picked up, broken trees can be cut down and new ones planted in their place. And yes, even flooded basements can get cleaned up and restored, and items that were damaged by any water can be replaced. So we can move past those things, because storms are those events that come and they go. But what about those times when the storms that come into our lives, into our experience, are just overwhelming to us? And the wind is howling, and the weight of what you're enduring and going through, it just feels so burdensome. It's overwhelming. And in the midst of that storm that we can experience in our hearts, whether it's due to a relationship struggle, or whether it's due to a health issue, whether it's due to something happening in a neighborhood or in a workplace, and we all have those experiences, right? When it just seems to be buffeting us, the wind, the rain, the lightning, everything, it just seems to be going on in our own heads and our hearts. And there are those times when we look up and we say, God, what is going on? Are you being quiet for a reason? And there may be even those times when the question is, God, why are you being quiet? It's like, God, why are you against me? What's going on here? There are those times in our lives when we can experience those storms. This is one of those Psalms we're going to look at today, that if you're having a bad day, it's almost a temptation for me to say, don't read this psalm, because it'll just make your heart sink a bit further. If you're having a good day, I might be tempted to say, don't read this psalm, because it's going to make your day seem a little bit darker. But the fact is, we need to engage with Psalm 89 as we need to engage with all the Psalms, because they speak to the reality of what we go through and how to go through it, and how God sustains His people in the midst of it. We're in a series called Summer in the Psalms, and I got to admit that I've not fully appreciated the organization of the book of Psalms. If you were to flip through the Psalms, you see there's a book 1, a book 2, a book 3, a book 4, a book 5, and they're the collection of these Psalms in these books that can have a particular theme or themes that seem to surface in each one of those books. But honestly, I've kind of felt like the book of Psalms has tended to be kind of like the kitchen drawer, or that drawer in your house where things accumulate, right? It might be in your kitchen. For us, it's in our kitchen. So if I'm looking for my keys or I'm looking for a pen, Susan would say, oh, go check the drawer. And I know which drawer it is, right? And you pull it open and it's full with stuff. It might be in your study, it might be in your bedroom, but there is that drawer. And in a sense, the book of Psalms, to me, it always struck me as one of those drawers, a very good drawer because it has lots of great stuff in it. But, I didn't fully appreciate the fact that, hey, it's split into 5 books, and each book has a special emphasis, a special character to it. And all of that contributes to the fact that in the New Testament writers quoted the Psalms more than any of the Old Testament books as indicating who Jesus Christ is and pointing to the reality of what Jesus Christ has done on behalf of his people. And so as you look at Psalm 1, Psalm 2, Psalm 3, or the book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4, book 5, each one has its own theme. We're going to be in book 3, the very last chapter, Psalm 89 of book 3. And book 3, out of all the books, tends to be the darkest, if you will. Tends to be the stormiest. It tends to have the collection of psalms that speak about how heavy and burdensome life is. If you read through those psalms in that book, some of the psalms wrestle with the reality of the fall of Jerusalem. That is the capital city of the Jewish nation, of the nation of Israel. And the grief that comes with that. It wrestles with the fall of the temple. That place where the people of Israel would gather to worship God, to worship the Lord, to worship the one who called them to be a people. And the temple at times had been destroyed, and some of the Psalms reflect the grief of that. God, what do we do now? But then in Psalm 89, it wrestles with what do you do when the king falls? That is the line of the king, the promised king for the people of Israel. What happens when his line collapses, when the royal line ends? The tension of book 3 and Psalm 89 in particular is what do you do when God doesn't simply go silent? It's not a matter that he goes silent, but he appears to be actively against you, actively engaged in oppressing. So turn to Psalm 89. It's a unique psalm written by somebody, Ethan the Ezraite. Most likely he's a member of he's a leader, leading a team of musicians in worship in response to God. And it's unique because of the way that it's structured and the themes that we see. For example, it talks about God's faithfulness being celebrated. But it also reflects on God's faithfulness being questioned. But he comes back around with God's faithfulness being anticipated. So let's take a look at Psalm 89 and starting off with a celebration of God's faithfulness. Starting in those first 4 verses of Psalm 89, in which we read this: I will sing of the steadfast love of the Lord forever. With my mouth I will make known your faithfulness to all generations. For I said, steadfast love will be built up forever. In the heavens you will establish your faithfulness. You have said, I have made a covenant with my chosen one. I have sworn to David my servant. I will establish your offspring forever and build your throne for all generations. Selah. Those are the first 4 verses. And it starts off as we would expect a psalm to go, because we tend to think of the Psalms as songs of celebration. And as we look at these first 4 verses even, there are some key words that jump out at us that are going to be found all the way through Psalm 89. For example, the word steadfast love. That's the Hebrew word hesed. We talked about that before. That is that the mercies of God being poured out. This isn't a one and done. This is a constant expression of God's mercy being poured out. That's repeated 7 times through this psalm. Forever is repeated 8 times through this psalm. Faithfulness, talking about God's faithfulness, is repeated 7 times throughout this psalm. The word covenant, which is key to understanding this entire psalm, is repeated 3 times. You see, Psalm 89 is based upon a covenant, that is, a promise that God made to David, found in 2 Samuel chapter 7. Now, what happened back there was David, for those of you who don't recall, was the shepherd boy who became the king. And he wanted to, as an expression of his love for God, his faith in God, he wanted to build a temple where he could worship and the people of Israel could worship God. And so he went to Nathan the prophet and said, Nathan, this is what's on my heart. I want to build this temple to God. And Nathan says, whatever it's in your heart, you go do it. That sounds awesome. But then God appeared to Nathan and said, no, tell David no. It's going to be for his son to build, but I got something even better for David. I'm going to make him a promise. I'm going to make with him a covenant. I'm going to speak these words that will be binding. 2 Samuel 7, verse 16. This is the Lord speaking. And your house and your kingdom, David, shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. That's what we call the covenant to David, or the Davidic covenant. It's that promise that God made to David. And so the psalmist in Psalm 89 reflects on this covenant. And he's expressing his praise to God. I invite you to read through the next 33 verses in Psalm 89. You know, sit down someplace quiet and read through it at some point, because as you read through the following 33 verses, you're going to see God is praised as the Lord of creation. In verse 5, Ethan the psalmist says, God, you are praised for your work in the heavens. You created the heavens, and it's awesome. You created all living creatures. They are all under you. You created them, oh God. And that is awesome. You have tamed the sea. You've caused it to go quiet. See, the sea for a person in that day and age was a place of chaos, and you can't control the sea. It was just this picture of utter lack of control, but God could control it. That's what he says in verse 9. So he's acknowledging God and he's praising God as the Lord of creation. And he also says that God is the Lord of his people. He starts in verse 14 and he's talking about that covenant that God made with David and said, you have anointed David and you've made this covenant with him forever. That his kingdom would be forever, that his family will be forever. You've said that, God, and I praise you for that. He rewords the covenant. He takes the words, he brings it in, and he says, he wraps up in verses 36 and 37 that you are going to do this forever. Your promise will not change. Verse 36, he says, his offspring shall endure forever. His throne, that is David's throne, as long as the sun before me. Like the moon, it shall be established forever, a faithful witness in the skies. Selah. You know what? The psalmist is looking and he's thinking about God's promises and he's thinking about, you know, what God had made a commitment to in terms of David, and he's just like, this is awesome. This is fantastic. Now, it's probably good that there's a break there at the end of verse 7 where it says Selah. Now, we're not totally sure what Selah means. It's probably like a musical notation, like a full rest. Just take a stop, take a breath. And it's a good thing that we take a breath here because, well, what we see now is God's faithfulness being questioned, a questioning of his faithfulness. Let me read for you from verse 38, and I'm going to read down through the rest of the chapter because I want you to hear this. This is when the storms are blowing, and in the moment, you got the questions. Listen and hear the questions that are being asked. But now you have cast off and rejected. You are full of wrath against your anointed. You have removed the covenant with your servant. You have defiled his crown in the dust. You have breached all his walls. You have laid his strongholds in ruins. All who pass by plunder him. He has become the scorn of his neighbors. You have exalted the right hand of his foes. You have made all his enemies rejoice. You have also turned back the edge of his sword, and you have not made him stand in battle. You have made his splendor to cease and cast his throne to the ground. You have cut short the days of his youth. You have covered him with shame. Selah. Oh, how long, O Lord? Will you hide yourself forever? How long will your wrath burn like fire? Remember how short my time is. For what vanity you've created all the children of man. What man can live and never see death? Who can deliver his soul from the power of Sheol? Selah. Lord, where is your steadfast love of old, which by your faithfulness you swore to David? Remember, O Lord, how your servants are mocked, and how I bear in my heart the insults of all the many nations with which your enemies mock, O Lord, with which they mock the footsteps of your anointed. Wow. You know, what a contrast to the first 37 verses. Up until now, there's been no hint that the direction, the psalm would turn in this dramatic direction. I was talking to my youngest daughter yesterday, and oftentimes my daughters will say, "Hey, Dad, you're preaching tomorrow?" I say, "Yeah." And "Well, what are you preaching on?" And I said, "Psalm 89. And so she said, "Oh, yeah?" I said, "Read it. Read the first 4 verses." "Oh, okay, seems simple enough. All right, let's drop down." And so we read through it, and she goes, "Dad, I'm glad you're the one who's speaking about it, not me." We look and we're like, wow. I mean, there are those psalms that cry out when God seems silent. This one seems to go one step further as Ethan the Ezrahite asserts, "God, you're responsible. You're the one who thrown down the crown of David. You're the one who's torn down the walls of Jerusalem. You're the one who's torn down the power base of the king, his strongholds. Everything has been stripped away." I mean, if we were to finish at verse 45, where it says, "You have cut short the days of his youth, you have covered him with shame," period, it truly would be a depressing psalm, because it would seem that we're just left in the midst of the storm with no hope yet ahead. But even in that question, when the psalmist says, "How long, O God, how long?" Even in that, it's a reflection of his heart to cry out to God in the midst of the storm, in the midst of his trouble. Do you hear it? He's saying, "How long, O God? I know your faithfulness is there. It's going to come back, but how much longer?" You see, he's making a choice there. It's a choice that you and I have to face when we're going through the struggles that we go through. He says, "How long, oh God? My life is short and my life is in your hands. How long, oh God?" Because the enemies around me, they're mocking me, yes, but ultimately you. My life is dependent upon your faithfulness to your covenantal promises. Oh God, how long? See, with that question, the psalmist is anticipating that God is faithful, even though in the midst of the storm, in the moment, it's not obvious, it's not necessarily apparent. Job illustrates, the possible responses we can have when we're going through our own storms. And I did think about Job. But for some of you who don't know who Job is, he was caught in a cosmic drama in which everything was removed from him. His children, his wealth, his everything, his health. And he sat on an ash heap trying to make sense of what he had just been through. And one response is to turn our backs and walk away in those moments, say, God is not fulfilling what he said he's going to do. I mean, this can be illustrated by what his wife said to him. His wife looked at him and said, listen, Job, take stock of everything that's happened. Why don't you just curse God and die? Why don't you just turn your back on him and feel the full weight of that? Is that possible for us to do? Sure is. That in the heartbreak and the heartache and the trying to make sense of things, we just say, I'm going in a different direction. I've seen people make that choice. Another response we can have is much like those comforters, those friends who gathered around him. We call them Job's comforters. They're there and they're saying, well, the reason why you're going through what you're going through is because of something you did wrong. So you just better pull yourself up by the bootstraps and make it right. The reason you're going through what you're going through, and they would come up with all these reasons, all these ways for Job to try to get out of what he's going through. And each one of them said, Job's like, wait a minute, what are you talking about? This is not helpful. And then there's Job's response. Clearly, he's trying to make sense of what's going on. And yet, in the midst of his pain, in the midst of his hurt, in the midst of his storm, he goes in Job chapter 13, verse 15, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Yet will I have confidence that God's faithfulness is there on behalf of his people. And we've seen people do that. You've seen people. And maybe you experienced that when you were going through that storm and you felt battered and broken against, threatening to have your faith beat up against the rock of disbelief and disenchantment and disillusionment. And you say, no, I'm going to keep my eyes on God. God, I don't know why you're doing this. It's frustrating me. I'm upset. I'm angry. But you are God. You are faithful, and I will trust. I will trust in your faithfulness. That's not denying reality of the hurt and pain we experience. It's acknowledging the fact that we have to respond when we find ourselves in that situation. And we're going to even turn our backs, go away, try as hard as we can, or we're going to make the choice to say, how long, O Lord? My life is in your hands. My life is in your hands. I've seen people do this, experiences that they've gone through, where it's pushed them to the edge, and they're so afraid, and they're so hurt, and yet they say, I will choose. remember that conversation with my daughter Shelby, who said she would never want to have to speak about this psalm. She went through her own intense period. Soul-wrenching, gut-wrenching experience when she went through a divorce. And in that moment, is she feeling the storm around her, trying to make sense of what was going on? Well, yesterday she shared with me a phrase that she came across. And she goes, I came across it on Instagram, but it seized my heart and it gave me focus. And she said, I'm not even going to get it right, but it goes something like this. If he leads you to it, he'll lead you through it. If he leads you to it, he'll lead you through it. And she goes, and that is what sustained me. Because I just thought, okay, God is with me even in those moments when the lightning is crashing and the sky is dark above me and the winds of questions and doubts are overwhelming, they're threatening me. I know there's a sun above the clouds, and there's the Lord who put the sun in place, and there's a Lord who created all, and there's a Lord who loves me and has me firmly in his grip. You see, we have choices in terms of our responses, much like, say, Jeremiah, who he was looking at the devastation of the city of Jerusalem, and he wrote the book called Lamentations. That's not going to make the New York Times bestseller list with a title like that, right? Lamentations. Filled with woe, 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 the W-O-E. Life feeling burdened, life feeling heavy. But as he looked at the devastation of the city of Jerusalem, the walls had been torn down, the people had been taken into captivity, he still said this: remember my affliction and my wanderings, the wormwood and the gall, that bitter taste in your mouth when things are going hard. My soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me. He's feeling the weight of it. He's looking around and he's seeing the reality and he's experiencing it. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will have hope. And because of that hope, he was able to see, and the Lord allowed him to see what was yet to come. Because he had that hope, he said, okay, the storms that we're seeing around us, that we're experiencing now, are but a moment. They're intense, they can be weighty, they can be burdensome, but my hope is in the Lord. And there was a revelation that the Lord gave to Jeremiah that reflected on God's faithfulness. In Jeremiah chapter 23, we read this: behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he shall reign as king and deal wisely, and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. Jeremiah hoped in the Lord, and because of that hope, in spite of the circumstances he found himself in, he was allowed to see ahead and know that God had something in his faithfulness that he was going to accomplish. Oh, Jeremiah may not have understood all the details of the promise that God was making when he said this, but it's pointing to Jesus. Much like the Apostle Paul cited Psalm 89 when he was speaking to people about Christ and the history, how God worked through history to bring Jesus to earth, God the Son, God in the flesh to earth to accomplish his purposes. He quoted Psalm 89 in Acts 13, reflecting that river, reflecting that movement of God through history. And he's looking back and he says, listen, Psalm 89, Jeremiah, everybody beforehand, they were pointing to Jesus. And now I'm pointing to Jesus too. Jesus is what it all came down to for Jeremiah, for Paul, for the psalmist. They saw God's faithfulness. And I'm going to invite the worship team up. You know, as we face those seasons, as we face those storms, as we face those challenging times, I want to call us to remember that God is faithful, even though in those moments when the wind is blowing and the lightning is crashing and the thunder is so loud you can't hardly hear yourself think, and your feelings and everything that's going on inside you in that moment that you're facing. God has shown his faithfulness to his people through Jesus Christ. That God came in the flesh at the right moment in history. That Jesus walked this earth for 30 plus years and was arrested and beaten and tortured. He was not at the wrong place at the wrong time and fell into the hands of the wrong man. He was at the right time, at the right place, and fell into the hands of the right people, for God had ordained. The Father had ordained that the Son would have to go through all that. That in his crucifixion, in his death, in his burial, through the breaking of Jesus' body, through the shedding of Jesus' blood, our sin might be paid for, that our freedom might be purchased, so that in the resurrection of Jesus and in his ascension, there is that day we're looking forward to when Christ himself will come again for his people, for you, for me, for those who trust in him. But until that day, that Psalm 89 was looking forward to, that Paul was looking back at, thinking about the person of Jesus, looking ahead to what God was going to fulfill, what he was going to complete. Jesus, on that night when he was betrayed, took bread and he took a cup, and he did it within the context of the Passover meal. That meal in which it celebrated the liberation of the Hebrew people from their slavery in Egypt. It signified the freedom of having their chains removed so that they might live for God as his people. Jesus took the bread, and I'd invite you to take the bread at this time and just hold it in your hands. He took the bread in that meal, and he said, "This bread is my body, which is broken for you." Now, the disciples at that moment didn't understand what he meant by that. But within a few short hours, yes, Jesus would be beaten and bruised. His body was broken, was sacrificed for us. And Jesus said, "Do this in remembrance of me." A key part of the Passover meal was taking that cup of redemption that signified the blood of a lamb that was slaughtered, that was sacrificed, and that blood was painted on the doorposts of the house so that when the angel of death came through, literally passed over the homes where it was painted on the doorpost. And Jesus said, you know, in this cup is the new covenant. It's God's new way of doing things. It's that new relationship that's to be found in my blood. That's to be found in my sacrifice. And through what Jesus endured, we move from being those that were walking far from God to those who, through faith in what Christ accomplished, are called His children, His sons, His daughters, part of His family. That God will not let go. That God has said, I will never leave you. Oh, no, I'll never forget about you. Even in the midst of the storms, I've got you in the palm of my hand. Jesus took that cup and He said, do this in remembrance of me. I don't know what in particular you may be going through right now. In a group this size, like I said before, it is a case where somebody may be going through a very dark season, a very hard storm. You need to know that you are not in this alone. After the service, a worship team will be up front. I'll be up front. We'd love to talk and pray with you. Not that we have the answer to the particular challenge that you have, but we can go with you before God the Father and pray with you about what you are experiencing, what you are walking through. As a matter of fact, I'd ask you to stand now and let's go before God in prayer. Oh, Father, we thank you for your word that is written to encourage us and to challenge us, to open up our eyes, yes, to the reality of the challenges we face, but the hope that has been purchased and secured for us through Jesus Christ our Lord. We thank you for the sacrifice He made for us. We thank you for the freedom that brings. We thank you for the life that brings. We thank you for the promises that brings, that we are your children. In Him we are your kids. That you have us firmly in the palm of your hand, even in the midst of our storms. O Lord our God, we worship you and we thank you for the hope we have because of Jesus, for we pray in His name. Amen.